All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. So we've got Stacie Williams is doing our Summit Encore presentation. And Stacie is going to be talking about tips and tricks for using D2L rubrics, then sharing how we can communicate grading criteria expectations through using the rubrics tool in D2L. And Stacie is communication studies faculty at Rock Creek. And once again, I encourage you to ask questions. So type questions into the chat area whenever you have questions, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question through the audio. So go ahead, Stacie, take it away.
Thank you all for being here today. I definitely welcome questions as we go throughout the presentation, and I've reserved some time at the end for questions as well. So if there's something that you want to know but you don't know where to fit it in, I'm going to give us some time for that at the end as well. And today we're going to look at some suggestions from the way too many hours I have spent playing around with the rubrics tool. Some successes and some absolute failures have also helped me figure out some ways in which rubrics can be really useful. So there are a lot of topics that we could cover related to rubrics. I thought we would look at finding content for rubrics, because you certainly can have what criteria you're assessing a student on, like writing mechanics might be part of it, but finding descriptive information to put into the rubric, sometimes when you're first building a rubric, can seem a little overwhelming. Because the numerical part, I think, makes sense to us as far as scoring. So we'll talk about that. I'm also going to talk about designing rubrics in the sense of some different functions in the rubrics tool that might make them a little bit more user-friendly. And then I am going to troubleshoot some rubric issues by actually going into a D2L shell that I made for my Summit presentation, which has a lot of the information I'm covering today in there. And I'm happy to add or work with anybody from online learning to add you to that really small repository I have, where I also have some sample rubrics in there. So there are places to go back to some of this information in the future, and we can chat about that when we leave. Because the troubleshooting rubrics issue part can be a little bit adaptive, I do have a couple of questions I wanted to start with just to get a pulse from what experience level people are coming with. I know I heard a little bit of there's some new people using rubrics, but I have a couple of questions here, and whichever one relates to you, I'd love to take just a moment to hear from a few folks so that I can anticipate adapting a little bit at the end. So you can either chime in with your microphone, or if you don't have audio right now, please feel free to type into the chat. I have it open and I'm monitoring that.
I'll chime in. I think what I wish that rubrics would help me do is, I have rubrics, but I have them external to D2L, so that's one issue. I always have to go back to them, and then frankly, because they're not in D2L right now, I just end up not using them. And I just kind of guess the grade based on what I'm seeing. And that's not how I want to be grading. That's not how we should be grading. And yeah, sometimes I guess too, like I'm not really sure what to put in the rubric. So, what am I assessing and how to word that? So I think those are the big things. I have the feeling that it won't be that big of a challenge to create the rubrics in D2L, because I've done a lot of work with D2L, but I just wanted some support behind it. So that's where I'm at.
Hi there, this is Sean. I guess my experience is similar to Jill's in that I'm hoping that rubrics can sort of help me communicate to my students what's important to me in the assignment, and also be consistent in my grading. I've laid out expectations sort of in different areas in the syllabus, and to some extent in the assignment text itself, but I'd really just like them to be able to see very clearly in a very compact format how exactly I'm thinking of it when I'm going to grade it, so they can sort of tick all the boxes if that's what they're interested in doing.
Stacie, I really like the mix of people here from different departments, and also a question that comes up in my mind is are rubrics, do you see them as equally useful in a great variety of subject areas? Are there any subject areas that you think that, well, maybe they're not all that important? A different type of system would work better.
Yeah, and given that I have a humanities and social science background, I have to do a little bit of imagining for STEM a little bit more. Although my husband's an engineer, and I saw him going through school, and you know, it's sort of the different approach to coursework that he certainly has than my background. So I think that's a great question. Maybe something we can ponder as we go through a few different parts of the presentation, because I think that's good to think about how maybe we adapt them to various models of teaching and pedagogy.
This is Susie. So I inherited a rubric from the last person that taught the class that I teach, and found that I wanted to rewrite it because you could get a pretty good grade without understanding some basic fundamentals of what I'm trying to teach the students. So that's why I was interested in this course.
Okay. So anybody else before we move on? Okay. And again, if anything pops up, feel free to type it into the chat, because I have that open as we're going through. One thing I will say is that to start with, I'm not really demoing anything that has to do with how to create a rubric in D2L. So if you've never used the integrated rubric tool in D2L, we'll just hang with me. The idea of rubrics and some of the things I talk about will apply universally. And then when we get into the D2L shell to have a look at a few things, you'll kind of see as I'm demoing a couple functions, some ways to create rubrics, but the mechanics of making some of that happen is certainly something that ITS folks, or even I'm willing to help you with one-on-one for some of that outside of this session. So we're looking a little bit more about some of the uses, not just how do I get a rubric started, but I'm happy to help with that at other times. So I thought before, and a lot of you have already hit on this, which is fantastic. I thought before I dove into a couple of things, just say, like, why are we using rubrics in the first place? And I think there are a lot of reasons. Two big ones have to do with grading transparency, which is something that was brought up. How do we communicate to our students the ways in which we'll evaluate them? Basically, how do we let them know what we're looking for? And I think this is really important when we think about equitable student success, because some students are coming from a background where they feel like they got a great education in how to write an essay or how to read between the lines of an assignment prompt and give a teacher what they're looking for. And some of our students haven't had that background. So the more transparency we provide, the better that is for our students. And I know, at least for myself, I'm looking for students to do their best work, and part of them doing their best work is how I design an assignment, but also how I let them know about how I'm going to score that assignment. The other thing that I think is really useful about rubrics for us as faculty is that they can help us save time. Before I was using rubrics with as much detail as I do, I found myself writing a lot of the same comments over and over again. I teach a lot of public speaking classes, so a lot of comments about things related to eye contact or gestures. There wasn't huge variation in the types of feedback I was giving, or there was a stock response that really applied that I could then follow up with something more specific. So I think it can streamline regular feedback. And the great thing is, a couple of you brought up not necessarily having rubrics in D2L. The great thing is if you have your rubrics set up in D2L, it makes scoring faster, and it'll drop your grades directly into the grade book for you. So there's one additional step of inputting grades and attaching rubrics to students via email or any of that that's cut down on. So I think, we're all so busy. Anytime we can save time, that's also a win. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about content for rubrics, and it's great that that's something that some of you are interested in. And then we'll talk a little bit more about designing rubrics with a little bit more attention to, like, mechanics and sort of the practical nature of rubrics. So the big question is like, how do I figure out what to put in my rubric? I certainly could say I'm grading students on their writing and their mechanics, but what do I say beyond that? And if I'm using a 1 to 4 scale, let's just say for assessing them, how do I communicate to a student the difference between a 3 and a 4, or the difference between a 3 and a 2? So I have a couple of suggestions for that I think can be really helpful, and some of them are a little more time consuming than others. So we're going to go through these. The first one that I highly recommend is to start now keeping a document with comments that you regularly provide to students. So in my interpersonal communication class, a thing that I noticed was regularly coming up on an assignment was students had a hard time distinguishing between reflected appraisal theory and social comparison theory. And I ended up writing a lot of the same clarifying statement to students. And that's an example of something that I now keep in a running Google Doc, where I noticed there was a pattern of some particular feedback a lot of students needed. And by creating my own repository of some generally applicable feedback, I've given myself something to pull from when I start to create a rubric that's tailored specifically to that assignment. So I find that's really helpful, whether it's in discussions or on specific assignments. Keep a running tally, because there's a lot of general feedback that applies to the content. Then you can give something personal to the student after sharing that instructive general content. And then within your different values of the rubric, also try to think, if you were to write a sentence for each of those, like how would you articulate to a student, this is what 100% work looks like. This is what 90% work looks like. So really try to write the rubric content from a point of view also that a student hopefully is looking at it ahead of time. And if you can let them know some of the nuance or the things that would be present or missing that could help them know where they might land on those scores, that's really useful. And as an aside, for peer review and other things before a large assignment is submitted, asking students to score each other's work on the rubric then is a great way for them to check how they're doing with the rubric you're actually going to use to grade them. So those are a couple of things that I think help with at least just your own feedback you regularly give.
Can I ask a question? So that first bullet, keep a document with comments that you regularly provide. I've heard of this before, and I did start keeping a document. Do you literally have D2L open on, maybe you probably have 2 screens, but like have D2L open on one screen and have this document open on the other? Are you literally cutting and pasting?
Sometimes,
okay.
Right? It's like, okay, this is a student, like I said, they don't understand the difference between these 2 theories, or they missed a key difference. And it might be a sentence that I like, oh, I've really worked on this being a helpful, instructive sentence. I might place that somewhere in the feedback that I'm giving to the student. But I also use that feedback that I use it as a way to keep track of what repeatedly happens in the assignment, and it lets me know I should maybe just put that in the rubric. I should maybe just put student, can offer a stark contrast between 2 theories, right? Because sometimes they miss the compare and contrast or something like that. So yeah, I have 2 screens open when I'm doing that kind of grading to kind of keep track of what I've seen in the past and what I'm seeing now, and I move information between the 2. Or if you don't have 2 screens, just kind of have 2 windows next to each other. That helps, or toggle. And like as a technical thing, I organize mine by week in D2L. So it's like week 1, what was my content? And I have a subheader for the assessment they're doing that week or the activity they're doing, and then a subheader for discussions, because I also keep track of this for discussions. All right, so another suggestion. Now, the AAC and U value rubrics are something that some of you might be familiar with. A little bit later in a couple slides, I'm going to show you some examples of them. They've been used by a lot of SACs for assessment of student learning when we do our annual assessment reports. They were a basis of the multi-state collaborative assessment that some of our SACs participated in. And very loosely, maybe they're a base for how we approached the DSAC work for our general education reform that we're doing right now. But I bring up the AAC and U value rubrics because one of the great things is we don't have to reinvent the wheel. If there are some helpful rubrics or components of rubrics out there we have permission to use, let's use them. And I'll show you an example of how I do that in a minute. One of the things I'll note, though, is the wording of the rubrics. They're meant to be applied to many different subject areas, and so some things are a little vague or broad or have parentheses, placeholders, or examples. So anytime you're looking at other rubrics to use, try to make sure you edit it with some student-friendly or student-facing language, using as much of the vocabulary from your class as you can. And also remember that for something like the AAC and U value rubrics, to cite those, it's good practice, and AAC and U has a process for doing that. So the AAC and U value rubrics, I just took a screenshot of the page where you can find the rubrics. It's aacu.org/values/rubrics. And when you get to this page, there is a box I've highlighted here that says download the rubrics. And then what that takes you to is this next page where the rubrics are, and you can download all 16. They have rubrics for assessing written communication, oral communication, then teamwork, quantitative reasoning, information literacy. They have some new ones related to assessing cultural competency. So there's a lot of different options here that as you're thinking about what your rubrics could look like, even if you don't use these, I encourage you to look at them as some examples for rubrics that contain descriptive content in them. I also want to point out that on this page, they can take you to another page that talks about how to cite the value rubrics. And you'll see when we go into a D2L course that I have how I've cited those. So this, you're not really supposed to be able to read all of this. That wasn't my intent, but this is an example of the written communication rubric. I don't use all of it for my assignments or my papers, but I do look at this control of syntax and mechanics section. And I'm not a writing teacher, I do teach communication, but I found that a lot of the description in each of these boxes was better formulated than what I might have been coming up with on my own. So after all the other pieces that I have associated with my rubric, I usually end with some feedback about their actual writing and how they were able to use language to communicate their ideas. It's not a very heavily weighted portion of my assignments, but I like to include it there. So that's an example of how I've integrated that. And all of these links to things like the value rubrics, those are in the small D2L repository that I can add any of you to. So you have a place to come back to some of these links as well. So again, this is an example of how I've used some of that. And I've browsed through all the other rubrics to get some inspiration for at least what I might do for some of my own rubrics. Okay, another place to look, and some of you are maybe very well acquainted with the fact that we are updating our general education list right now. So everybody who's on the gen ed list now or wants to be is going to be visiting a committee called GEARS, which is actually a committee that I sit on. And part of that is creating a signature assignment for the course that maps to one of these DSAC rubrics that has been created. So there's one for arts and letters, one for social sciences, and one for the STEM related disciplines. And those rubrics, because they could relate specific to your subject area, so this kind of comes back to Greg's question earlier about using rubrics in different subject areas. Those rubrics developed by faculty here at PCC might also be a place to look for inspiration. There's a Spaces page that has all of the current versions of these rubrics listed. And so I would encourage you to go and have a look at that. And I don't Greg currently have a link to the spaces page for the DSACs, but I can find it by the end and paste it into the chat. Again, the language might need to be finessed to be student friendly, but the DSAC rubrics have been created by PCC faculty in those disciplines. So they're for us to use and modify for student facing assignments if we'd like. And a lot of us are already getting some experience trying to align some assignments with these rubrics for to be assessed in alignment with these rubrics. So that's sort of another place to look for content. And then the last place that I would say, and you'll see an example of how I've used an open ed rubric in a few minutes, is that open educational resources, they're not just about what sort of free or free and editable textbooks exist, but there's also a lot of other resources that faculty have created and shared in various repositories. And I adopted a very well put together rubric from a faculty member on the East Coast who actually created this rubric out of some academic research that she did and had published in a journal. And so that rubric has been something I've been able to use in my own class because she made it available as an open education resource. So I would encourage you to browse that for inspiration, or sometimes you can adopt all of or part of those rubrics. If you want to get started, openoregon.org is a great place to go, but all of the reference librarians at all of our campuses are really well versed in finding open education resources, and I know they'd be thrilled to help you with that. So that's another place to look for content that could go in our rubrics. So now we get to actually designing rubrics, and the most important thing that I have learned from what has seemed like at times a little bit of blood, sweat, and close to tears a few times is don't try to start building your rubric by opening the rubrics tool in D2L. You'll focus a lot more on how the tool looks and how it works. It's not always easy to edit, and if you change your mind about things, that can be a problem. So I really suggest starting with pen and paper or moving it to a Word document pretty quickly and design what you want your rubric to look like. Finesse the language and the text. I think you will be a lot happier with how you can build a rubric in D2L if you do some of that work outside of it first. It's also easier to save a version, come back to it, but I think it's best to work outside the tool. Otherwise, the way the tool looks or the way the tool works can constrain our thinking to what's possible with rubrics. So I really would encourage you to start with some pen and paper, then actually create a table or a mock-up in Word of what you expect your rubric to look like. Then the great news is from there, it's a matter of some copy and paste into the rubrics tool because you have finessed all the language. And then a couple of other things, 2.3 here, use the custom points feature we're going to look at next. This is the most important thing I ever learned to do in D2L related to rubrics. And it's not necessarily intuitive, and it's not the default setting for rubrics. So we're going to look at that piece next. So to create a new rubric, and we'll go into D2L in a second and have a look, you go to the course admin tab, you select the rubrics tool, and then you hit new rubric. And what you're going to get is a screen that looks like this. And the custom default is always points. And what you'll notice is that if you look underneath the levels, so level 3 has 3 points associated with it, level 2 has 2 points. You are welcome to edit those now. However, everything in level 3 has to have the same point value. And that's problematic if, say, level 3 is my proficient, like 85% of the total points possible is what I give people there. But say content development is worth 25 points, and then citing of sources somewhere later is only worth 10%. Well, I have to give them all the same point value, so I can't weight importance of different things in my assignment. And I used to find this very frustrating. I would create subcategories to try to change the point values, and it made for a really complicated rubric. So the thing that will make your life the easiest is to always choose the custom points feature. And I have that in a pink kind of red box here. When you choose custom points, then it's going to change things so that in the criterion, you have the points available, not in the level. So level 4 is maybe my outstanding work, like that's top 100%. Maybe it is 4 points here, but there's something, criterion 2 is a really important part of the assignment and it's worth 50% of the grade. So for some reason now that's 5 points instead of 4 points. So essentially what it does is it gives you the flexibility for each criterion to choose what your point values will be. And even if a lot of them stay the same, this is helpful because once you choose a points value, you're kind of stuck with it. So if you always choose custom, you at least give yourself the ability to edit how much each criterion is worth in the end. So that is like my #1 tip I always give to everybody. Always use custom points, never use anything else. Although, another way that you can use rubrics, which can be really helpful, is to use the, actually the box is in the wrong spot, I should say. The box should be up at no score, is to use the no score function. And what it does is it creates a rubric that has levels, but it doesn't have any points associated with it. And this can be really helpful if you are grading students on a pass, no pass. Maybe for some assignments, that's how you have it set up. But you could still put descriptive feedback in there that you would regularly give to students as a way to give them some feedback on their assignment and have a rubric for it, even if when you go into the grade book, you're selecting pass or no pass. I also find that for formative assessments, this is helpful. So if students are going to turn in a draft and I'm just giving them feedback, and maybe because of that it's a pass, no pass, I like to use the same rubric I'm going to grade them with, or portions of a rubric I'm going to grade them with, but not associate any points, just focus on the descriptive text. And I have a couple of examples of that I'll show you in a minute. So this can be great too if you do contract grading, where you don't necessarily have a numerical score associated, but you're looking at a certain threshold of a score that needs to be completed. And if you have more questions about contract grading and things, that's sort of a whole other thing, and that's something else that we can talk about kind of outside of this session. So those are 2 things to think about when it comes to how you are using those rubrics. Any questions right now before we take a look at some live rubrics?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Actually, can you go back to that slide again? Sorry. There we go. Thank you. I'm very visual. The levels, do students know, do you have those defined somewhere, what the levels mean, so students know what those mean?
I do, and you'll notice the box are editable. I never leave them level 4, 3, 2, or whatever. I usually use something else.
Oh, like proficient, excellent, I don't know.
Developing or emerging.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just didn't take the time to edit this one. I just wanted to show you how to get started, but you'll see in some of my examples how I've named things.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to D2L here. And again, what I'm in right now is a D2L shell that I am happy to add everybody to. And folks have been added to this with instructor privileges so that you actually can get into the course admin area and take a look at the rubrics that I have, that I've imported into the course. The course itself has some of the things we just went over that I used in my summit presentation, which have to do with designing rubrics and editing rubrics as well. And we'll talk about editing rubrics in a minute, but I've screen captured and made a couple of short videos here that you can come back to that came out of the session that we did. I have some examples in the rubrics tool, but I gave an example of how I've used rubrics for formative assessment. And so here you can see that I renamed the levels. This is actually a screenshot from my D2L course. So I have an advanced, a proficient, a basic that says 70 to 80%, because with custom points, sometimes depending on how the student did, I go in and I change the score. And this is descriptive content that came from one of the open education resource rubrics I was talking about. And so this work from Dr. Shriver about public speaking, I've used in my class. So I don't have any numerical values here, but when students do a practice of part of their speech and I want to grade them on their introduction and their use of verbal and nonverbal delivery, I just open up this rubric and score it because it's the same rubric. This is the full version of the rubric. There's 10 sections to this one. This is the full rubric they get scored on, and the point values are here. And you can notice that for advanced, because the topic is only 6%, it has 6 points, but the introduction is 10% of the overall score, so it's on 10 points. And so this is an example of where custom points became really important in how I design the rubric, because otherwise I have to try to get everything to be equally weighted, and that's actually not how I want to score students. You'll also notice that I put in parentheses the percentage. So how I figure this out is, say the 10 is always an easy number to work with, but if it's 10 points, what's 90% of 10 points? Well, it's 9, and here this was 6, 90% is 5.4, which is how I get to some of these kind of funky decimals. But what it means is as I'm scoring a student's speech and I'm clicking through these different parts of the rubric, then it is auto-summing the total score for me down here. And I've also created a little bit of description when it'll auto score if they fall into the advanced, proficient, basic category. So this was fantastic to take from a very valid, well-tested rubric that was available via OER. And so that's how, and I've changed the language in a few spots here and there, but that's how that was really helpful to create a rubric that I can use both summatively, but up here I can take just a couple sections of it for smaller assignments and use it for formative assessment. So that's an example there. And so again, this top one here is the no score. And if you were doing contract grading or pass, no pass grading, this could be a really great way to still capture feedback that you have. And as you can imagine, giving feedback on an introduction, it can be pretty common that a lot of times I write, well, your attention getter was not really attention getting, right? Like if that's something I routinely would score somebody on here, it goes into the rubric. A couple other things that I want to point out while we're here, I'm going to go into the course admin area and look at the rubrics tool. So I've imported rubrics from various classes that I teach, for example. You'll notice this starts to become a pretty long list of stuff, and that I actually have information in the description here. I think this is an underutilized function because very quickly the number of rubrics you have in here can get messy, and remembering which version of a rubric you're on is really important. One thing that I want to point out, which is a common problem, is that once you've used a rubric to score a student, you get this lock symbol. Some of you have probably seen this before. The lock symbol is like, say here on homework 2, we can see that. Once the lock symbol is there, I can't edit the content in the rubric. Even if I make a copy of my course, because it's a new quarter and I'm teaching a new quarter, but I thought, oh, that thing in the rubric didn't work really well in a previous version. I need to update something. The thing that I have to do with this once it has a lock is to go ahead and to make a copy of the rubric. And when I make a copy of the rubric, then the lock has gone away. So now we see copy of homework 2, and I can actually go in and edit the rubric now. And I would highly, highly encourage, this is like my second most important tip about rubrics. Once you've started editing some by making copies, always add a rev date, because what will happen is that you'll make changes in here, and if you don't change the name, when you go to an assignment folder to pick which rubric, you're gonna have 5 that say homework 2 communication behaviors without any idea of knowing which version that it is. And I have accidentally associated an old version of a rubric more times than I can count. So using a naming convention that lets you know what version you're on is the easiest way to think about editing rubrics, because we can't edit them once we use them, but we can make a copy, change the name of it to update whatever we're at. And here I can go ahead and then edit the text or edit the point values as I need to. So that has really saved me a lot of time and frustration and going back and having to change versions. Is give yourself a good naming convention with a rev date that you know you're always selecting your most recent version. We had a great question about formative versus summative assessment. So this is a great question. Summative assessment means you've turned in your final paper, I'm giving you a grade and we're moving on. Formative assessment might be like, give me a draft and I'm going to give you feedback on it so you can use that before you're turning in another assignment. So it's meant to shape and steer a student's trajectory instead of just being, well, you gave it to me and here's the grade. So using those in conjunction, which I think a lot of people tend to do whether they know it or not, is really helpful. So hopefully that helps add clarity there. So yeah, editing rubrics is a little frustrating, but if you just know that you have to make a copy and change the rev date, then that's really helpful as well. The other thing I'll say is I had mentioned that I think that the description of rubrics is underutilized. When you scroll to the bottom, there's this options area, and if you expand that, you can create a description for yourself. So I don't know, this is not elegant, but I could at least put in the date. And what this will do is now when I'm here looking at homework 2, my most updated one, notice how there's a quick note to myself here about what this rubric is when I'm in the rubrics tool. I can't see this comment when I'm in an assignment folder associating a rubric, but when I'm just trying to look at my overall rubrics and what I have in a course, on this view here, I can go ahead and see the description. Students will never see this description, but it's a way for me to keep track of and organize or make sense of what's in a rubric. Notice I had nothing in the original one that I copied. So I think giving yourself some notes in the description area is also helpful to kind of make sense of what's what, because as you can see, if you use different rubrics for every different assignment, like I have one activity every week and I always use a different rubric tailored to that activity, you can get a lot of rubrics. And for the speech rubric that I showed earlier, the one that I use to assess my student speeches, this is where for myself, I put the citation for the OER rubric that I used and that I had used it with permission from Dr. Schreiber. So those are some ways you can kind of think about that as well. Let's see if there was anything else I wanted to show in here. Oh, and one more thing that we can take a look at when it comes to rubrics. So this is an example of my discussion rubric, which this discussion rubric is in the course shell. I've had a few people take copies of it to kind of modify for their own classes. I'm totally happy and fine with you using this as a basis if you want. Notice that this one I have 4 levels of assessment for scoring my students' discussion. So their initial post is the content and analysis, and their response to peers is in the learning community engagement section. But down here, I created a subgroup to my rubric, and I can show you how to do that quickly. I created a subgroup that just has 2 categories. Did they turn it in on time? Great, you get your 100% points for that. Did you follow netiquette? Great. And obviously it's just 10% or like 1 point for each out of 10. But I didn't need to have a range of 4 options for scoring this. I don't even know what I would put in here, and for me it was just get it in on time or not. So I found that just having a sort of you did it or you didn't do it section of my rubric worked best for my needs. So if you also find that there's sort of a pass no pass style thing you'd like to have on your rubric, just create a second category for that, and then you don't have to have 4 levels of criteria, which I've found to be really helpful. So if you are going to create these subcategories, then let's just say you're going to do a new rubric. And this is something, again, that our ITS folks or myself can help you with. You just would go ahead and add another criteria group, and I could get rid of, well, I should have gotten rid of the higher levels. I can get rid of as many levels as I need. So now I just have 2, but I have what I needed up here above. So really consider using the criteria groups, again, if you need to have 5 points of evaluation and then somewhere else you only need 3 or you only need 2. That's really the tidiest way to do it, instead of having a lot of columns that are blank and say NA or something like that. I think the grouping can work really well. So those are a couple of tips and tricks in here kind of to get you started with. There's, I guess, a lot more we could do, but it can get a little overwhelming. So I just wanted to highlight that you can come into this and look at various different styles of rubrics that I have in here. I have like a general homework scoring rubric I use in one of my classes. Another one, I have individualized homework for each assignment. Please feel free to take a look at the variety of options that I have here, and yeah, and have a look at that. The other, oh, and Yuli, I'll the sub-rubric thing, I got a question about that. And Kevin, I'll take people's email addresses at the end to add you to the class. Yuri, when you scroll down, there's this button underneath the first initial criteria that said add criteria group. All you need to do is click that button. And then anything from the criteria groups you want to get rid of, that's what this trash can logo is for. So I could get rid of all of level 4 if I just wanted 3 levels of assessment. Or I could add additional criteria, or if I need to add a level back, that's what this is for. And so again, like, we have fabulous ITS folks who can work with you on some of those intricacies. But this is also why it's great if you go with pen and paper first to design your rubric and say, what do I wish it looked like? And then we can come to the tool and try to make it do the things that we want it to do. Lastly, the one thing that I'll point your attention to, which we don't necessarily need to spend a ton of time going over here because I created a short video for it, but another special scenario that comes up sometimes is in one of my classes, I have a final project that students can choose from one of 4 options. And because they're pretty different from each other, there are 4 different rubrics for assessing that. So it actually is possible to associate multiple rubrics to one folder and choose just one of them for grading. So if you have students who are turning in different types of things, maybe you just have an assignment folder that's called final project or final exam, and you have various things, which is what I have here on the final project, you can add multiple rubrics, which I have screenshot here. There's 3 different rubrics, and I just chose no default rubric. That way, when I go to grade, I actually get the name of all 3 rubrics listed, and then I choose in the assignment folder which rubric I'm going to use for that particular student. And I found that that's been really helpful so that I don't have to create 4 different folders depending on which type of assignment the student chooses as their final project. It's easy for students. It comes into one place, and then all of the rubrics are there and visible for students, and it also makes my grading easier because I just choose which one corresponds to the type of assignment they did. So that's another thing that I underutilized and made things way more complicated than they needed to be. So I did create a short video here about how to associate multiples, and again, I'll take people's email addresses at the end and we can get you added to this little repository. So those are a couple scenarios probably to get most people started with kind of editing and playing with, making some copies of rubrics and those types of things, which I think have covered most of the questions. For some of you who had rubrics that were external to D2L, you're in a great place because really what you have to do is copy and paste some of that content into the rubrics tool and use the number of levels and criterion that correspond to how you want your rubric to be. And the other thing that I would say is the value with the rubrics themselves is that when we attach them to assignment folders, they become transparent to students so they can see them as part of the instructions. And That way students have access to how we're going to score them. And then when we go to do the scoring, the rubric's already there, and it's a matter of clicking and adding feedback for it to then be added into our grade book. And some of those linkage functions, again, are something that you could have the ITS at one of your campuses walk you through in your individual course.
So the rubrics inside of D2L, they are D2L has improved the system quite a bit in recent years, as I recall. So the rubrics can be attached to discussions and gradebook, and students don't have to, they can access them in both places. Is that correct? They could, so the discussion rubric, or do they need to go to the gradebook to look at the discussion rubric? Something specific like that.
So the assignment itself can have the rubric attached. The great thing is now one of the updates D2L made a couple years ago is when a student goes to the grade book and that's where they'll see, oh, I got a 9 out of 10 on my discussion. There is a hyperlink there that says view student feedback, or maybe it's an icon now. There's a piece there that the student can click and it opens up the scored rubric directly from the grade book. So they don't have to go back to another place in D2L. They've really improved the ability of students to access their scored rubrics from their grades tab, which used to be a problem. I used to have to tell students, go back to the assignment folder and that's where you can see my feedback. And that's no longer the case. They can access everything from the grades tab.
Great.
Yeah. So a quick recap from some of the things we just looked at. Because I know I threw a lot at you. And again, I am so happy to chat with anybody after this session in the months or years to come about this. Rubrics can't be edited once they're used to score student work. So if you've been frustrated by that little lock symbol, that's why. Rubric edits are made by making a copy to then edit and really try to use some good naming conventions. Add content to the description area, which is like for your eyes only, that, hey, what's actually in this rubric? And so you get to that by when you're editing your rubric, hitting the expand button to the options section. Some unique uses of rubrics. We talked about those text only, or D2L calls them no score rubrics. And those can be fantastic for contract grading, pass, no pass. And also, don't forget you can associate multiple rubrics to one assignment, and that can really solve some of your organizational issues in D2L, keep you from having multiple folders. And I really think rubrics are great because they help students experience greater transparency. They save us time. I've saved myself a ton of time in some of the routine feedback that I give. Again, remember they can't be edited, so get some good rubric hygiene in place is what I'm going to call that. And then don't forget that formative assessment can be a way to use rubrics, that just to give students some feedback on an assignment before they actually turn it in is a really great way to think about those rubrics. So I know we're close to being short on time, and I am, I'll put my email address here too. I'm happy to take questions outside of this session once you've mulled it over or you try to get into doing some of this work yourself. But is there anything, anything that folks have a burning question about that they want addressed before we leave?
Yeah, we are out of time, but I'm sure that Stacie is willing to stay a little bit longer if anyone has questions.
Yeah.
If you do need to leave, feel free to take off. If you do need to leave, that's fine. And
again, send me an email if you have questions. If you have to take off now. If you go ahead and send me your email address, then I can, or if you just want to type it into the chat, whichever works easier for you now, I can go ahead and get you added to the small D2L shell that I made for my summit presentation. And that has all this information. You can go back in, and I'll post a link to the PowerPoints I went through today as well so that you have access to those.
Now, somebody earlier had a question about the analytic versus the holistic rubrics, and I'm not sure, Stacie, it looked like all of yours were analytic. I don't know if you've even tried the holistic one and know much about that. Okay, so that may be a question for one of the ITS later, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Yuli actually sent me a note not long ago, kind of thinking how she was thinking about holistic rubrics instead of assigning points. So we had an offline conversation about that a little bit, but that's an area that I haven't done as much work in because I've mostly used the analytic because they serve the purposes for what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I did a quick search and found one that highlights the differences between the two. So, and there are other websites out there that talk about it as well. So take a look.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for sharing that link.
Well, excellent. Stacie, thank you very much. This has been very helpful, very enlightening.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks all for coming.
Thank you.
And oh, Stacie, if you could switch over also to that, the website, so the blog post for anyone who might like to visit that. When you log into D2L, you have a link at the top that talks about the Encore, the Summit Encore sessions, and you can click on that. That'll take you to this page, which will have a recording of all the sessions. So Casey already has one up here about H5P, for example, that she did a week or so ago. So take a look, and we'll see you at a future session. Thanks all.